Okay, well, we're going to be starting in Job chapter 3 in just a moment. This is the outline of the book that we're following. We've, the past couple of weeks, looked at the first two chapters with the prologue, which is written in a prose form. And we had here the testing of Job, and we were given the background to Job, where he came from and his circumstances, and then the events that happened in the presence of the Lord, with the adversary being allowed to test Job, first of all, through the loss of Job's wealth in the form of the various animals, the flocks and herds that he possessed, and then with the loss of his 10 children, the death of his 10 children. And despite all of those things that happened, Job retained his integrity. He didn't blame God for what had happened, as the adversary thought that he would. And so the adversary then wanted to put the pressure upon Job a bit more, and went back to the Lord. And the Lord then allowed the adversary to afflict Job with some sort of physical harm, some physical condition, and that took the form of what appears to have been some dreadful skin disease affecting Job's the whole of his body, from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head. And yet, despite these things, once again, Job retained his integrity. His wife advised him to curse God and die. Well, Job didn't take her advice, and we ended up seeing Job sort of cast out, sitting amongst the ashes, the city rubbish dump, and then his three friends arrived, coming along to comfort and console him. And we ended up last week seeing them sitting in silence for 7 days, sitting alongside Job, with no one saying anything for that period of time. So we're going to come into the longer section of the book now, from chapter 3 through to chapter 27, which is this debate between Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And this section of the book, this long section of the book, is composed of a cycle of 17 speeches, which are presented in the form of poetry. They're arranged in three groups, so there's three rounds of speeches here. In this section, 9 speeches are made by Job. 3 are made by his friend Eliphaz, 3 by Bildad, and 2 by Zophar. When we come to the third round, Zophar only makes 2 speeches, compared to, in every other case, 3 speeches are made by each of the three friends. And the speeches are often very emotional and intense. The speeches are not presented really as a formal debate in which arguments are put forward and then challenged. Rather, they're more like conversations, sometimes picking up on what's been said in previous speeches. They can often seem a bit disconnected and a bit repetitive. But in his speeches, Job is trying to understand his experience. He's struggling in his own mind with what has happened to him. At times, he addresses God directly, telling God exactly how he feels and what he thinks about things. So there is a difference between the outbursts in the speeches of Job that we have here and in his passive response, his passive acceptance of things in the opening 2 chapters. In the opening 2 chapters, when things happened, he simply said, well, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But here in the speeches, we have much more. We're told much more about how he's really feeling about this. But he still recognizes that God has the right to do as he wishes. And Job's main concern seems to be with his relationship with God. To him, it seems that he's lost his relationship with God, and that's why he's in such torment. And so he wants the opportunity to present his case against God. It's as if he wants to take God to court and have his day in court with God, in order to get an explanation out of him for all that's been going on. So this evening we're going to look here in chapters 3 to 5, and so we begin with Job's lament in chapter 3, and then we begin with the first round of speeches. And this evening we're looking at Eliphaz's first speech in chapters 4 and 5. So there's quite a bit for us to get through here this evening. So we begin then in chapter 3, which is Job's lament, we've entitled it, and we'll read first of all chapter 3 verses 1 to 10. There's three main divisions in the chapter here. First of all, in verses 1 to 10, Job curses the day of his birth. And then in verses 11 to 19, Job wishes he had never been born. And then in verses 20 to 26, Job speaks of his sufferings. So read chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. Afterward, Job began to speak and cursed the day of his birth. Job spoke up and said, "Perish the day on which I was born, and the night it was announced, a male has been conceived. May that day be darkness, may God above have no concern for it. May light not shine on it, may darkness and deep gloom reclaim it, may a pall lie over it, may what blackens the day terrify it. May obscurity carry off that night, may it not be counted among the days of the year, may it not appear in any of its months. May that night be desolate, may no sound of joy be heard in it. May those who cast spells upon the day damn it, those prepared to disable Leviathan. May its twilight stars remain dark, may it hope for light and have none. May it not see the glimmerings of the dawn, because it did not block my mother's womb and hide trouble from my eyes." So after sitting for 7 days in silence with his friends, Job now speaks up. And what he says is quite shocking. The adversary had assumed that Job would curse God, but instead Job curses the day of his birth. Job wishes that he had never been born, because then he would not have suffered as he does. And he wishes that day on which he had been born and the night when he was conceived might perish. The prophet Jeremiah had something similar to say as well. Jeremiah, like Job, suffered much. And in Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 14 to 18, Jeremiah says something very similar to what we've just read from Job here. Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 14 begins, "Cursed be the day on which I was born, the day when my mother bore me, let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, a son is born to you, making him very glad. Let that man be like the cities which the Lord overthrew without pity. Let him hear a cry in the morning and an alarm at noon, because he did not kill me in the womb. So my mother would have been my grave, and her womb forever great. Why did I come forth from the womb to see toil and sorrow, and spend my days in shame?" So Jeremiah felt much the same about his life as we see Job here. Job wishes that any record of that day of his birth might be wiped out. And he piles up here phrase after phrase in verses 4 to 10 to emphasize just how much he wants this day to be done away with. He speaks of it being made into darkness with there being no light, that God may have no concern for it, that it may be removed from the calendar, wiped out of the calendar, that it be desolate or barren, that there be no sound of joy to be heard on that day, that it might be cursed, that it may not see the coming of the dawn. In verse 8 there, Job mentions Leviathan, uses the name Leviathan, and Leviathan was the name of a mythical sea creature often featured in creation stories from other cultures. And it was a sea monster that was associated with chaos and disorder. And God will describe Leviathan in some greater detail when we come to chapter 41. Leviathan is also mentioned in some other places, in Psalm 74 verse 14, Psalm 104 verse 26, and Isaiah chapter 27 verse 1. Here, mention of Leviathan, the thought may be that of those who could rouse up Leviathan in order to blot out the light and to bring this chaos and disorder to the day of Job's birth. 3 stages of daybreak are described there in verse 9. He speaks of the twilight stars, light, and then the glimmerings of the dawn. And the reason why Job curses the day of his birth in verse 10 is because he says, "It did not block my mother's womb and hide trouble from my eye." So Job would rather have stayed in his mother's womb than be born and experience the trouble that he is going through. The next section here, verses 11 to 19, Job goes on to wish that he had never been born. So he goes on to say this in verse 11, "Why did I not die at birth, expire as I came forth from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me, or breasts for me to suck? For now would I be lying in repose, asleep and at rest, with the world's kings and counsellors who rebuild ruins for themselves, or with nobles who possess gold and who fill their houses with silver. Or why was I not like a buried stillbirth, like babies who never saw the light? There the wicked cease from troubling. There rest those whose strength is spent. Prisoners are wholly at ease. They do not hear the taskmaster's voice. Small and great alike are there, and the slave is free of his master." Job now asks, well, if he had to be born, then why did he not die at birth? In verse 11, expire as I came forth from the womb. Why was he welcomed into this world? Why were there knees to receive him and breasts to feed him, a mother to nurse him? If he had died at birth, he thinks that he would have been better off. He would be at rest in the afterlife, present with kings and nobles and with stillborn babies, with the wicked, with the prisoners and with servants. Death is seen as a trouble-free existence for everyone. In verse 19, he says, "Small and great alike are there, and the slave is free of his master." So he sees death as being the great leveler, that all are the same in death. There are no social distinctions. Wealth and possessions are of no value. They'd be of no use in death. So death would be preferable to what Job is currently experiencing. And he doesn't see death as bringing rewards or joys, but simply as a relief from the suffering and the trouble. And although he expresses this wish that he could die, Job never contemplates taking his own life, never contemplates suicide. Job's view of death and the afterlife is somewhat limited, as it is in the rest of the Old Testament. Teaching on death and the afterlife is something that's more fully developed in the New Testament, following on from the resurrection of Jesus, where much more has been revealed to us. The final section in chapter 3 on Job's Lament then is verses 20 to 26, in which he reflects upon suffering. He says here, "Why does he give light to the sufferer and life to the bitter in spirit, to those who wait for death, but it does not come, who search for it more than for treasure, who rejoice to exultation and are glad to reach the grave, to the man who has lost his way, whom God has hedged about. My groaning serves as my bread, my roaring pours forth as water. For what I feared has overtaken me, what I dreaded has come upon me. I had no repose, no quiet, no rest, and trouble came." So since Job cannot get his wish that he had never been born, or his wish that he had died at birth, he now questions why light and life is given to those who suffer, who long for death, but it does not come, who search for it more than treasure, and who are glad when it does come. In verse 23, he asks, why has light been given to the man who has lost his way, whom God has hedged about. Back in chapter 1 and verse 10, the adversary had said that God had put a protective fence or hedge around Job, which is why Job was good. But here, that idea seems to be being used in a negative sense, that God has hedged him about. Perhaps the idea is of being hidden from God's view and thereby neglected by God, or of being trapped or hedged about with suffering. Job then reflects upon his own condition. His groaning, he says, serves as my bread. So the groaning that he's going through his suffering, it's like food to him. And he speaks of his roaring, pouring forth as water. So roaring over the suffering he's going through, it's like it's gushing out of him like water. So it's a great cry of anguish here. And groaning and roaring are what he's saying, these are my bread and water. This is what I'm living upon. And then the things that he feared and dreaded most have come upon him. He says in verse 26, I had no repose, no quiet, no rest, and trouble came. So we get the sense of the anguish and the agitation that Job is going through here. Job's words in this chapter really show the depth of his despair and the great pain that he is in. And today, I suppose people would try to perhaps diagnose some sort of mental health problem that he's going through. As we know, he's suffering bereavement. His 10 children have died. He's lost his position. He's lost his wealth. And he's suffering physically from this terrible skin condition. In the chapter, he asks the question why several times. Why is he going through this? Why can't he just die and let it all be over with? How can he reconcile his faith in God, God who he believes is good, with what he's facing in his life? And how is his faith in God going to survive all of this? Why is God treating him differently now to how he had been treating him in the past? These are the questions that are troubling Job. Well, we come now into the first round of speeches, and the first speech will come from Job's friend Eliphaz here in chapters 4 and 5. If you were trying to give comfort to someone, to console someone who has suffered and lost as much as Job had, what would you say to them? In these situations, when we try to say something, we often get it wrong because we don't understand what they're going through, or we make some wrong assumptions about their condition. And this is the case here with Job's friends in their speeches. They think they know the answers. They think they know why Job is going through this, but they don't really understand. And so they misinterpret his situation and they get it wrong. And that's perhaps how we often are as well. We try to help people, we try to say the right thing, but often we put our foot in it, and what we say is perhaps not as helpful as we thought it might be. Well, let's look here at what Eliphaz has to say in his first speech, and we'll read chapter 4, verses 1 to 11. Then Eliphaz the Temanite said in reply, if one ventures a word with you, will it be too much? But who can hold back his words? See, you have encouraged many. You have strengthened failing hands. Your words have kept him who stumbled from falling. You have braced knees that gave way. But now that it overtakes you, it is too much. It reaches you, and you're unnerved. Is not your piety your confidence, your integrity your hope? Think now, what innocent man ever perished? Where have the upright been destroyed? As I have seen, those who plough evil and sow mischief reap them. They perish by a blast from God, are gone at the breath of his nostrils. The lion may roar, the cub may howl, but the teeth of the king of beasts are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and its whelps are scattered. Job's friends have heard this terrible cry of Job in chapter 3, and the first to respond to that here is Eliphaz the Temanite. Eliphaz begins politely and cautiously, but he feels compelled to say something. In verse 2, he begins, "If one ventures a word with you, will it be too much? But who can hold back his words?" It's like he's saying, well, do you mind if I say something to you? Would you mind if I had a word with you? And Eliphaz begins by paying tribute to Job's reputation, how in the past Job had encouraged and supported others in their time of need, verses 3 and 4 there. But now this trouble has overtaken Job, and it's too much for him. Eliphaz says it has unnerved him. And Eliphaz suggests that Job's hope and confidence in his piety, or his fear of God, and his integrity, his good character, is misplaced. Because he asks, when have you ever seen an innocent man perish, or an upright person destroyed, as is happening to Job? Eliphaz then seeks to apply the widely held principle, which he says that he has observed, to Job's case, that people reap what they sow. Good will be rewarded and evil will be punished. That's a principle we find often in the Bible. Psalm 1 and verse 6, the end of that first psalm. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Psalm 34, verses 15 and 16. Psalm 34, verse 15 and 16. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears toward their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. Again, God's taking care of the righteous, but he's against the evildoers. Psalm 37, verse 25. I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or his children begging bread. The righteous are always provided for, not forsaken, their children not begging bread. And then in the New Testament as well, Paul in Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, he states the same principle. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. This is the retribution principle. Good is rewarded and evil is punished. And here what Eliphaz is saying, that if people plough evil and sow mischief, that is what they shall reap, and God will destroy them. He's using a picture from agriculture of ploughing and sowing, ploughing evil and sowing mischief, and then you reap the consequences. The prophet Hosea also has a similar statement in Hosea chapter 8 and verse 7. Hosea 8 verse 7. For they sow the wind and they shall reap the whirlwind. And then still in Hosea chapter 10 and verse 13. You have ploughed iniquity, you have reaped injustice, you have eaten the fruit of lies. Then verses 10 and 11 here, back in Job, Eliphaz uses the lion and its cubs as an illustration of the end of the wicked. Now, although as a general principle it is true, we do reap what we sow, and we must face the consequences of our own decisions and choices, perhaps not always in this life, but it is also the case that sometimes we reap what we have not sown, that we suffer the consequences of the decisions and the choices that have been made by others. And on the other side, sometimes we enjoy the benefits of what others have sown, undeservedly so. And sometimes even those who sow evil reap good things. The psalmist observed this in Psalm 73 and verse 3 when he said, I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. The wicked were prospering, and I envied them. So Eliphaz seems to view Job's situation, Job's suffering, as a simple cause and effect relationship, with the cause being determined by looking at the results. So he's looking at what Job is going through, the suffering, and he's come to the conclusion, well, you must have done something. This is why this is happening to you. You did something to deserve this. Well, Eliphaz continues here in verses 12 to 21 by recalling an experience that he had of a vision that came to him at night time. He says, a word came to me in stealth, my ear caught a whisper of it. In thought-filled visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear and trembling came upon me, causing all my bones to quake with fright. A wind passed by me, making the hair of my flesh bristle. It halted. Its appearance was strange to me. A form loomed before my eyes. I heard a murmur, a voice. Can mortals be acquitted by God? Can man be cleared by his Maker? If he cannot trust his own servants and casts reproach on his angels, how much less those who dwell in houses of clay, whose origin is dust, who are crushed like the moth, shattered between daybreak and evening, perishing forever, unnoticed. Their cord is pulled up, and they die, and not with wisdom. Eliphaz here describes a nighttime vision which came to him by a spirit or wind. The word for spirit and wind is the same in the Hebrew language, whilst he's asleep. And it was a fearful experience, causing, he says, his bones to quake with fright and the hair of his flesh to bristle. So his bones are shaking and his hair is standing on end. And the appearance of this spirit was something strange, and its form, he says, loomed before his eyes. A murmur was heard, and then a voice asked, can mortals be acquitted by God? Can man be cleared by his Maker? The question is, can a human being be regarded as righteous or pure by God? And this spirit then argues that if God cannot trust his own servants and charges his angels, those members of the heavenly council, those sons of God who we met in chapters 1 and 2, if God charges them with error, then how much less those who dwell in houses of clay, whose origin is of dust. So he's referring to human beings there when he speaks of those who dwell in houses of clay whose origin is of dust. That's us. Human lives, he says, are crushed like a moth, that their lifespan is something that is brief, just like a day, lasting from daybreak to evening. And they die unnoticed, collapsing like a tent when the cord is pulled up. So human life is fragile and temporary. And so how can one like this stand before a God who is so great and be considered righteous? What could such a person expect from God? Well, he goes on in chapter 5 now. If what he's just said about humans is true, then he goes on to say this, call now, will anyone answer you? To whom among the holy beings will you turn? Vexation kills the fool. Passion slays the simpleton. I myself saw a fool who had struck roots. Impulsively I cursed his home. May his children be far from success. May they be oppressed in the gate with none to deliver them. May the hungry devour his harvest, carry it off in baskets. May the thirsty swallow their wealth. Evil does not grow out of the soil, nor does mischief spring from the ground. For man is born to do mischief, just as sparks fly upward. So if this is true, what he said about humans there in that vision that he had of that spirit saying these things, it would be futile then for Job to call out, because who's going to answer him if humans are really that worthless? And who can he turn to amongst the holy beings, amongst those spiritual beings? Eliphaz then describes the fate of the fool in verses 2 to 5. And the fool here is the one who has rejected God. When the Bible speaks of the fool says in his heart there is no God. The fool is the one who has rejected God and follows the way of wickedness. Not talking anything about a person's intellectual ability. It's their rejection of God. And Eliphaz concludes that misery and trouble do not just come about from nothing, germinating from the soil by itself, but they come from the condition of the human heart, and they are as inevitable as sparks flying upwards. And he's not speaking directly of Job's situation, this would seem to be what he is implying here, that Job is responsible for these things that have happened to him. So once again, it's back to this cause and effect relationship, that you reap what you sow. And so Job must in some way be responsible for these things. Well, he then goes on to talk about the character of God in verses 8 to 16. He says, "But I would resort to God. I would lay my case before God, who performs great deeds which cannot be fathomed, wondrous things without number, who gives rain to the earth and sends water over the fields, who raises the lowly up high so that the dejected are secure in victory, who thwarts the designs of the crafty so that their hands cannot gain success, who traps the clever in their own wiles, the plans of the crafty go awry. By day they encounter darkness, at noon they grope as in the night. But he saves the needy from the sword of their mouth, from the clutches of the strong. So there is hope for the wretched. The mouth of wrongdoing is stopped." Eliphaz now tells Job what he would do if he was in this situation. In verse 8 he says, "But I would resort to God. I would lay my case before God. I'd take my case to God." And he then describes the character of God here in terms of God's power and God's justice, that he performs great deeds which cannot be fathomed, wondrous things without number. God controls the affairs of men to raise up the lowly, to give victory to the dejected, to thwart the plans of the crafty, to trap the clever in their own deceits, and to save the needy from the strong. And he says that it is this God who will give hope for the wretched. The mouth of wrongdoing is stopped. One commentator, David Atkinson, in his book, The Message of Job, says this on this. The whole of Eliphaz's argument is based on his view of the moral perfection of God, in the light of which Job must see that he is in the wrong. This is the basis of Eliphaz's argument, God's perfection. And in the light of that, well, Job has to acknowledge that he must be in the wrong. The final section of this first speech then is in chapter 5, verses 17 to 27. And Eliphaz concludes by saying this: "See how happy is the man whom God reproves. Do not reject the discipline of the Almighty. He injures, but he binds up. He wounds, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles. In 7, no harm will reach you. In famine, he will redeem you from death. In war, from the sword. You will be sheltered from the scourging tongue. You will have no fear when violence comes. You will laugh at violence and starvation and have no fear of wild beasts. For you will have a pact with the rocks in the field, and the beasts of the field will be your allies. You will know that all is well in your tent. When you visit your wife, you will never fail. You will see that your offspring are many, your descendants like the grass of the earth. You will come to the grave in ripe old age, as shocks of grain are taken away in their season. See, we have inquired into this, and it is so. Hear it and accept it. Here in these verses, Eliphaz expresses his view of suffering and trouble, that God is using these things to reprove and to discipline a person. And the person who suffers this should then consider themselves blessed. Verse 17, he says, "See how happy or blessed is the man whom God reproves. Do not reject the discipline of the Almighty." So God is doing this to you for your own good, and he will ultimately deliver you from this. So he injures, but he binds up. He wounds, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles. In 7, no harm will reach you. And then Eliphaz lists the situations from which God will deliver and protect a person. So he mentions famine and war, scourging tongue, violence, and wild beasts. So all will be well in the home and in the fields. There will be many offspring and many descendants. And he concludes by saying, you will come to the grave in ripe old age, as shocks of grain are taken away in their season. So using the image again from agriculture and the harvest there at the end of life, that it would be like the gathering in of the harvest. And Eliphaz is confident that what he says is true. And he concludes in verse 27, "See, we have inquired into this, and it is so. Hear it and accept it." He said, we've looked into this, and this is so. This is the truth. Hear it and accept what I'm saying. There may be some truth in what Eliphaz has to say, and we see from other passages of Scripture how suffering or trouble can be used by God as a disciplinary process. The writer in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 to 11, mentions this. And the writer in Hebrews here quotes from the book of Proverbs, and he says this, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5, "And have you forgotten the exhortation which addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor lose courage when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines him whom he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons, for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time at their pleasure, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." So here again is this idea that suffering is part of God's disciplinary process, that God is training us when we suffer these things. And then in the book of James chapter 1, verses 2 and 4, 2 to 4, James says, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you meet various trials, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So consider it joy when you suffer these things. Again, that ties in with what Eliphaz has said there in verse 17. See how happy is the man whom God reproves. Do not reject the discipline of the Almighty. So there is some truth in what Eliphaz has to say, and but it doesn't apply universally to every case, and it did not apply to Job's case. And it must have been very difficult for a man like Job, who has lost as much as Job has, to listen to this, to have someone say, well, count it all joy that you're going through this suffering. This is good for you. This is doing you good. This is God's way of disciplining you. To go to someone who is suffering in that way and to say those things must be very, very hard, particularly in Job's case when he knows what his own situation is. So essentially then Eliphaz is telling Job, this is really all your own fault. You need to take responsibility for this, and you need to accept this as God's discipline. God is disciplining you, and then you will be happy. That seems to be what Eliphaz is telling Job here. And he has such confidence in this. We've inquired into this. We're the clever ones. We've done the research, and we know this to be the case. So you just listen to us and you accept it, and all will be well. Okay, so there's a few questions that we might reflect upon from what we've looked at here this evening, these 3 chapters. How do you react to Job's wish that he had never been born? How do you feel about his words there when he speaks like that? How does Job's view of death and the afterlife differ to your own? Who does Job think is responsible for his suffering? And then what is right in Eliphaz's view of human suffering and trouble? What bits does he get right? And then what is wrong in Eliphaz's view of human suffering and trouble as well? And next week, we'll look at Job's reaction to this. How does Job react to what Eliphaz has just said? And that will be in chapters 6 and 7. So that's for next week. So we shall